The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning when the mountain mist still clung to the pine trees like secrets refusing to be told. Margaret Chen pulled her worn flannel robe tighter around her shoulders as she stepped onto the creaking porch of her cabin, bare feet recoiling from the cold wooden planks. The envelope sat there like an accusation, thick and official, bearing the seal of the United States Department of Natural Resources in embossed blue ink that seemed to mock the faded paint peeling from her porch railings. She knew what it was before she opened it: the final notice. If you're enjoying this story of one woman's fight against corruption, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Your support helps us bring you these amazing tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The one that would strip away the last piece of her husband's dream, the one thing she'd fought to keep through 3 years of mounting medical bills and sleepless nights spent calculating and recalculating numbers that never seemed to add up to enough. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal, not from the October chill that swept down from the Colorado Rockies, but from the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from fighting a war you know you're losing. "Dear Mrs. Chen," the letter began, in sterile bureaucratic language that felt like ice water in her veins. "This serves as final notice regarding the outstanding property taxes on Lot 47B, including the water rights to what is locally known as Willow Lake. Total amount due, $47,832.15. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in forced sale of the property to recover debts owed to the state of Colorado." Margaret sank onto the porch swing that David had built with his own hands 12 years ago, back when his hands were still steady and his lungs could still pull in mountain air without the rattle that would eventually consume him. The chains groaned under her weight, a sound that harmonized perfectly with the ache in her chest. $47,000. It might as well have been $47 million. Her savings account held exactly $1,247.33, and that had to last until her next disability check arrived in 2 weeks. Through the trees, she could see the lake that had become both her sanctuary and her burden. Willow Lake spread across nearly 15 acres of what the locals called deadwater, a dark, still body that never seemed to catch the light quite right, never sparkled the way mountain lakes should. For the past decade, it had been slowly dying, or so everyone believed. The fish had disappeared first, then the waterfowl stopped coming during migration season. The water itself had taken on an odd, oily quality that left rainbow sheens on the surface and a metallic taste in the air. "Polluted," the county inspector had declared 5 years ago, shaking his head as he sealed off the area with bright yellow tape. Industrial runoff from the old mining operations up the mountain, probably been seeping down for decades. Lake's toxic, best to just let nature reclaim it. Nature, it seemed, was in no hurry to reclaim anything. The lake remained, stubborn and lifeless, a 15-acre reminder of promises broken and dreams deferred. David had bought this land because of that lake, convinced it would be their slice of paradise where they'd build their retirement home and watch grandchildren skip stones across crystal-clear water. Instead, it had become the anchor that was dragging Margaret down into financial ruin. The sound of gravel crunching under tires pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. A black sedan was making its way up the narrow dirt road that served as her driveway, moving with the careful precision of someone unfamiliar with mountain driving. Government plates. Margaret's stomach clenched as she recognized the official bearing of the vehicle. She'd been expecting this visit ever since the certified letters had started arriving with increasing frequency. 2 men emerged from the sedan, both wearing identical navy suits that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of towering pines and granite teaks. The older of the two, a man with silver hair and the kind of polished shoes that had never touched anything rougher than office carpet, approached her porch with a briefcase in one hand and what might have been mistaken for a sympathetic smile if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Agent Harrison from the Department of Natural Resources, and this is my colleague, Agent Webb. We're here to discuss your property situation." Margaret set down the letter, her hands finding their ways to the pockets of her robe. I assume you're here to tell me when you're taking my land? Actually, Harrison said, climbing the porch steps without invitation, we're here to offer you a solution. He opened his briefcase and withdrew another envelope, this one crisp and white, bearing no official seals or intimidating letterhead. The department has been authorized to make you an offer for your property, a cash offer that would resolve your tax situation immediately. Cash offer? Margaret's laugh came out bitter and sharp. For polluted land nobody wants? What are you offering, $50? Webb, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. $100, ma'am. Cash, today, along with complete forgiveness of all outstanding property taxes and a federal guarantee that you'll never be held liable for any environmental cleanup costs associated with the lake.
The number hit Margaret like a slap. $100 for 15 acres of Colorado mountain land, even polluted land, was insulting beyond measure. David had paid $40,000 for this property back in 2008, when the real estate market was in free fall and mountain properties could still be had for reasonable prices. Even accounting for the lake's contamination, the land itself had to be worth something. She began, then stopped herself. What was the point of indignation when you were drowning? $100 was $100 more than she had, and it would free her from a debt she could never hope to pay. It would let her walk away from this place that had become more of a tomb than home. Let her start over somewhere cheaper, somewhere that didn't echo with David's laughter or smell like his morning coffee. There is one condition, Harrison continued, his voice taking on a carefully neutral tone. The sale would need to be completed within 48 hours, and you would be required to relocate immediately. The department needs to begin remediation work as soon as possible. 48 hours? Margaret stared at the two men, something cold and suspicious beginning to coil in her stomach. You're telling me the government is willing to pay cash and forgive nearly $50,000 in taxes for a worthless piece of polluted land, but only if I sign today and leave tomorrow? The contamination situation is quite serious, Mrs. Chen, Webb said, his tone suggesting he'd practiced this explanation. We've recently discovered that the pollution may be more extensive than originally believed. For your own safety and to prevent further environmental damage, immediate remediation is essential. Margaret glanced toward the lake. Something wasn't right. In 3 years of dealing with government bureaucracy, she'd learned that federal agencies didn't move fast for anything, and they certainly didn't throw money at problems unless there was something valuable at stake. I need to think about it, she said finally. Of course, Harrison replied, but his smile had tightened almost imperceptibly. However, I should mention that this offer expires at 5 o'clock today. After that, the department will be forced to proceed with standard foreclosure procedures. They left the contract on her porch table, along with a business card that felt heavier than paper should. Margaret watched their sedan disappear down the mountain road, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She was trapped. $100 or nothing, an insulting buyout or complete financial ruin. She was still sitting on the porch swing 20 minutes later when another vehicle came up the drive, this one a battered pickup truck that she recognized immediately. Her heart lifted for the first time in hours as she watched her son, Danny, climb out of the driver's seat, his long frame unfolding with the easy grace of a 26-year-old who'd grown up scrambling over these mountains. Danny had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn streak, along with a geology degree from Colorado State that he'd been trying to turn into steady employment for the past 2 years. He worked seasonal jobs now, ski instructor in winter, hiking guide in summer, odd jobs and part-time work filling the gaps in between. It wasn't the stable career Margaret had hoped for when they'd scraped together tuition money, but it was honest work, and he was happy. That had to count for something. "Mom?" he called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the particular note of concern she'd been hearing more often lately. "I saw government plates heading down the mountain. Everything okay?" Margaret held up the contract, watching her son's face change as he read the terms. She could see David in the way Danny's jaw tightened when he was thinking hard, the same expression he'd worn as a boy when working through difficult math problems at the kitchen table. $100? Danny looked up from the papers, his voice incredulous. Mom, this is insane. Even with the contamination, this land has to be worth more than that. And the timeline, 48 hours? That's not how government acquisitions work. There should be appraisals, environmental assessments, public hearings. Maybe for normal circumstances, but we're not in normal circumstances, are we? I owe nearly $50,000 in back taxes. I can't pay it. If I don't take this deal, they'll take the land anyway and I'll get nothing. Danny was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the contract to the lake and back again. I could practically hear the gears turning in his head, that analytical mind that had always asked too many questions and never accepted simple answers. What if there's another option? He said finally. What if the contamination isn't what we think it is? Danny, Margaret began, but her son was already heading toward the water, his long strides eating up the distance between the porch and the shoreline. The morning sun had climbed higher now, burning off the mist and throwing everything into sharp relief. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to really look at the lake that had become her albatross. There was something about it that had always bothered her, something beyond the obvious signs of contamination, the way the water moved, perhaps, or didn't move, the unusual clarity despite its dark color, the complete absence of any algae or plant life along the shores.
Mom, Danny's voice carried a note of excitement now, the same tone he'd used as a child when he'd discovered something fascinating in the woods. Come look at this. Against her better judgment, Margaret found herself walking toward the lake, her bare feet silent on the pine needles and rocky ground. Danny was crouched at the water's edge, pointing at something just beneath the surface. Look at the bottom, he said. Really look at it. Margaret peered into the water, expecting to see the usual detritus of a stagnant lake. Fallen branches, accumulated silt, maybe some discarded trash. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. The lake bottom was clean, almost pristine, covered with what looked like a fine layer of crystalline sand that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. That's not contamination, Danny said quietly. That's mineral deposits, and if I'm right about what kind of minerals... He trailed off, pulling out his phone and snapping several photos of the water and the unusual bottom formations. Danny, what are you thinking? Her son stood up, his face animated with the kind of intellectual excitement she hadn't seen since he was in college. I'm thinking we need to do some research, and I'm thinking you shouldn't sign that contract until we know exactly what the government wants with your worthless polluted lake. Margaret looked at her son's determined face and felt something shift inside her. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist, and somewhere in the distance she could swear she heard the faint sound of heavy machinery starting up, as if someone, somewhere, was... Margaret Chen sat at her kitchen table as the afternoon light filtered through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, casting everything in a hazy, dreamlike quality that matched the fog in her mind. The contract lay spread before her like a tarot card promising either salvation or damnation, its clean white pages a stark contrast to the chaos of unpaid bills, medical statements, and collection notices that had taken over what used to be David's workspace. She traced her finger along the edge of a photograph tucked between the papers. David, at 42, standing by Willow Lake on the day they'd closed on the property. His smile was wide and genuine, arms spread as if he could embrace the entire mountain range. "Our piece of paradise, Maggie," he'd said that day, using the nickname that only he had ever been allowed to use. "This is where we'll grow old together." The irony wasn't lost on her that the lake in the background of that photograph, crystal clear and reflecting the sky like a mirror, bore no resemblance to the dark, lifeless water that now stared back at her through the kitchen window. Time had a way of corrupting everything beautiful, turning dreams into burdens and paradise into purgatory. The bills represented more than money. They were the paper trail of her husband's final battle. "We could have managed," she whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice barely audible above the hum of the ancient refrigerator that wheezed and rattled like an old man's chest. "We could have managed. If the lake hadn't gone bad, we could have sold it separately. David always said the water rights alone were worth a fortune." But the lake had gone bad, slowly and mysteriously, turning from the pristine mountain water that had originally attracted them into something that looked more like an oil spill than a natural body of water. The transformation had been gradual enough that Margaret hadn't noticed it at first, too consumed with David's declining health to pay attention to much else. By the time she realized something was wrong, the damage was done. Property values in the area had plummeted, and their dream of retirement security had evaporated like morning mist. The sound of Danny's truck returning broke through her reverie. Through the window, she watched her son climb out of the cab with an armload of equipment she didn't recognize: metal containers, testing strips, and what looked like a small electronic device with various sensors attached. His face wore the expression of intense concentration she remembered from his college days, when he'd come home for holidays with his head full of geological theories and rock samples in his pockets. "Mom, I stopped by Professor Martinez's lab at CSU. He let me borrow some testing equipment." "Danny, honey, what are you doing?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew. Her son had inherited David's stubborn refusal to accept simple answers, along with his own academic training in the very field that might be able to explain what had happened to their lake. "I'm going to test the water," he said, setting his equipment on the counter with careful precision. "Real tests, not just visual inspection. pH levels, mineral content, dissolved solids, heavy metals, everything." "Margaret, what are you thinking?" Margaret felt something twist in her chest, a mixture of hope and fear that she'd grown too familiar with over the past 3 years. "Danny, what if you're wrong? What if it really is just contaminated water and I'm sitting here waiting for a miracle that's never going to come?"
Her son turned to face her, his expression softening as he took in her appearance. Margaret caught her reflection in the window and winced. When had she become this person? This hollow-eyed woman in a faded flannel shirt and jeans that hung loose from weight she'd lost without trying. When had she stopped caring about her appearance, stopped caring about anything beyond just getting through each day? "Tell me about the early years," Danny said, settling into the chair across from her. "When you and Dad first bought this place, what was the lake like then?" Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself drift back to memories that usually hurt too much to revisit. "It was beautiful," she said softly. "So clear you could see the bottom, even in the deep parts. Your father used to joke that it was like looking through glass. The water was ice cold, even in summer, fed by underground springs that came down from the peaks." "Underground springs," Danny repeated, making a note on a pad he'd pulled from his pocket. "What else? Were there fish?" "Oh, yes. Rainbow trout, brown trout. David used to fish there every morning before work. He'd catch our dinner more often than not." Margaret's voice grew stronger as the memories flooded back. "And birds. So many birds. Ducks during migration, herons that would stand perfectly still at the water's edge. I used to watch them from the kitchen window while I made coffee." "When did that change?" The question hit like a physical blow. Margaret opened her eyes to find her son watching her intently, his pen poised over his notebook. "Gradually," she said. "So gradually I didn't notice it first. David got sick, and I was so focused on doctors and treatments and—" She trailed off, unable to voice the daily terror of watching someone you loved disappear piece by piece. "Try to remember," Danny said gently. "When was the last time you saw fish in the lake?" Margaret thought hard, sifting through years of memories clouded with grief and stress. "Maybe 4 years ago?
David was still well enough to fish then, but he started complaining that he wasn't catching anything. He blamed it on overfishing, said maybe we needed to stock the lake with fingerlings. And the birds? They stopped coming about the same time. I remember noticing because I'd gotten used to their noise in the mornings. When they disappeared, the silence was... She shuddered. It was like the lake had died. Danny made more notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. What about the color change? When did you first notice the water looking different? 3 years ago? Maybe a little more? Right around the time David was diagnosed. Margaret's voice grew bitter. I remember thinking it was fitting, somehow. Everything in our lives was turning dark, so why not the lake, too? Mom, Danny said quietly, what if the timing isn't coincidental? What do you mean? Her son leaned forward, his voice taking on the excited edge she'd heard earlier by the lake. What if whatever happened to the lake happened suddenly, not gradually? What if what you perceived as gradual change was actually your mind trying to cope with too many crises at once? Margaret stared at him, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. You think I just didn't notice? I think you were dealing with Dad's cancer, mounting medical bills, and probably not sleeping much. I think a lot of things could have slipped past your attention during that time. Danny's voice was gentle but insistent, and I think that might be important. The kitchen fell silent, except for the labored breathing of the old refrigerator and the distant sound of wind through the pines. Margaret found herself thinking about those dark months when David's diagnosis had turned their world upside down. She remembered the sleepless nights, the constant worry, the way days had blurred together in an endless parade of doctor's visits and insurance calls and desperate internet searches for miracle cures. There was construction, she said suddenly, the memory surfacing like something long buried. Up the mountain, some kind of mining operation, but they said it was just exploratory, temporary permits they told us at the town meeting. Danny's pen stopped moving. When? 4 years ago? Maybe 4.5? They said they were looking for rare earth minerals, needed to do some test drilling. There was opposition from some of the environmental groups, but the company had all the right paperwork, said they'd be gone in 6 months. Were they? Margaret tried to remember, but those months were a blur of David's treatments and her own exhaustion. I think so. I stopped paying attention to anything that wasn't directly related to David's care. Danny was writing furiously now, his excitement palpable. Mom, what if the mining operation found something? What if they found something valuable enough that they needed to cover their tracks? Cover their tracks? How? By making the lake appear contaminated, by making sure no one would want to buy property in this area, driving down land values until they could acquire everything they needed through tax forfeitures and distressed sales. Margaret felt her world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath her feet had shifted without warning. That's a pretty big conspiracy theory, Danny. Is it? Her son stood up, beginning to pace the small kitchen with nervous energy. Think about it. A legitimate mining operation would have to file environmental impact studies, deal with public hearings, pay fair market value for any land they needed. But if they could make the area appear worthless, contaminated, they could buy it for nothing, Margaret finished, her voice barely a whisper. Exactly. And if you're dealing with rare earth minerals, elements that are crucial for technology manufacturing, we're talking about potentially billions of dollars in value. Margaret looked at the contract on the table, seeing it now through entirely different eyes. The urgency suddenly made sense. The insulting offer, the 48-hour deadline, the immediate relocation requirement, it all pointed to someone who needed to secure the property quickly, before anyone could ask too many questions. But Danny, she said, voicing the fear that was growing in her chest, even if you're right, what can we do about it? We're talking about taking on the federal government or a mining company with enough influence to manipulate government agencies. We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have money for anything. Danny stopped pacing and turned to face her, his jaw set with determination. We have something better than money, Mom. We have the truth. And we have Dad's stubbornness. Despite everything, Margaret found herself smiling at that. David had been legendary for his refusal to back down from a fight he believed in. "Your father would have loved this," she said. "He always said the best way to catch a liar was to make them think they were smarter than you. So we let them think we're desperate and stupid. We make them believe we're going to sign that contract. Meanwhile, I run every test I can think of on that lake water. And if you're wrong, if the lake really is contaminated and we're just grasping at straws?" Danny sat back down, reaching across the table to take her hands in his. They were strong hands, calloused from outdoor work, but gentle in their touch. David's hands had been like that once, before the illness had made them thin and fragile. "Then we're no worse off than we are right now," he said. "But Mom, what if I'm right? What if Dad's dream of this place being our paradise was more prophetic than he knew? What if we're sitting on something so valuable that powerful people are willing to break laws to get it?" Margaret looked into her son's eyes and saw David's unwavering optimism reflected there, the same belief in possibilities that had led them to buy this remote mountain property in the first place. It was a dangerous kind of hope, the kind that could lead to heartbreak or triumph with equal probability. But as she sat in her kitchen surrounded by the detritus of financial ruin, watching her son gear up for what might be the fight of their lives, Margaret felt something stirring that she'd almost forgotten existed. Not just hope, but purpose. For 3 years, she had been drifting, surviving one day at a time without any real reason to keep going beyond simple stubbornness. Now, suddenly, she had a reason to fight. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Danny's smile was pure David, wide, confident, and slightly reckless. "First, we need to buy time. Call Agent Harrison, tell him you need until tomorrow morning to make your decision. Make it sound like you're wrestling with sentimental attachment, not suspicion. And then? Then we start gathering evidence. I'll test the water, research the mining permits from 4 years ago, see what I can find out about rare earth deposits in this area." Danny's voice grew more animated with each word. "You can help by going through Dad's papers. He was meticulous about documentation. If there was anything unusual happening on the mountain during those months, he would have noted it."
Margaret thought about the boxes of David's papers she'd stored in the bedroom closet, unable to bear going through them, but unwilling to throw them away. Bills, receipts, newspaper clippings, notes about local politics and environmental issues. David had saved everything, convinced that information was always valuable, even when its purpose wasn't immediately clear. "There's something else," she said suddenly. "The timing of this offer. Why now? If they've been planning this for years, what made them move so aggressively today?" Danny considered this, his expression growing thoughtful. "Maybe they found out we're about to lose the property anyway through tax forfeiture. Maybe they're worried someone else might swoop in with a better offer. Or—" He paused, something dark crossing his features. "Maybe they know I'm here, and they're worried about what a geologist might figure out if given enough time." The thought sent a chill down Margaret's spine. "You think they've been watching us?" "I think people with enough power to manipulate federal agencies don't leave things to chance," Danny said grimly. "Which means we need to be careful. If I'm right about this, we're not just fighting for the lake anymore. We're fighting for our lives." Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the water that had become the center of their world. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lake that had been David's dream and her nightmare. But now as she watched the dark surface, she found herself wondering if maybe her nightmare had been someone else's carefully constructed illusion. "Mom?" Danny said from behind her, his voice soft but determined. "Whatever happens, we're going to find out the truth. Dad would have wanted that." Margaret pressed her hand against the cool glass of the window, feeling the vibration of wind through the pines and the distant rumble of something that might have been machinery or might have been thunder from the peaks. "Yes," she said quietly, "he would have."
But as she stood there watching shadows lengthen across the water, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were already being watched in return, that somewhere in the darkness beyond the tree line, someone was measuring their every move and finding them either amusing or dangerous. Either way, she realized, they were committed now. The die was cast, the game was afoot, and tomorrow morning would bring either vindication or disaster. There was no middle ground left, no safe haven to retreat to. They would stand and fight for David's dream, or they would lose everything. But for the first time in 3 years, losing everything felt like a risk worth taking. Dawn broke over the mountains with the pale, hesitant light of October, casting everything in shades of silver and shadow that seemed to mirror the uncertainty hanging over the Chen property. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning through possibilities and fears in equal measure, and she found herself standing at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee while the world was still more promise than reality. Danny had been up even earlier. She could see him down by the lake, crouched at the water's edge with his borrowed testing equipment spread around him like the tools of some arcane ritual. The sight of her son working with such focused intensity brought back memories of David in his workshop, the same careful attention to detail that had made him such a good electrician and such a reliable man. The phone rang just as she was considering whether to join Danny at the lake or give him space to work. Agent Harrison's voice came through the receiver with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd been awake for hours. "Mrs. Chen, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to follow up on our conversation yesterday." Agent Harrison. Margaret kept her voice carefully neutral, remembering Danny's advice about appearing conflicted rather than suspicious. "I was going to call you this morning. I need a little more time to consider your offer. I understand this is a difficult decision. However, I should stress that time is of the essence. The environmental situation has grown more urgent overnight." "More urgent how?" There was a pause, just long enough for Margaret to hear what sounded like papers shuffling in the background. "Our environmental team has detected increased seepage from the lake. We're concerned about groundwater contamination spreading to neighboring properties. That remediation work really can't wait." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. If they were lying about the contamination, this new urgency was clearly manufactured. If they were telling the truth, then Danny was risking his health by working so close to the water. Either way, the pressure was increasing exactly as her son had predicted. "I understand," she said carefully. "Could I have until noon today? I just need a few more hours to wrap my head around leaving this place." Another pause, longer this time. "Of course, Mrs. Chen, noon it is, but I have to stress that we really can't extend the deadline beyond that. The safety concerns are simply too great." After hanging up, Margaret found herself staring at the phone as if it might reveal the truth behind Harrison's words. Increased seepage, environmental urgency. It all sounded plausible enough, but the timing felt too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their investigation to be coincidental. She made her way down to the lake, stepping carefully over the rocky ground in her worn hiking boots. Danny looked up as she approached, his face grim with concentration. "How's it going?" she asked, settling onto a fallen log that had served as an impromptu bench for years. "Strange," Danny said, holding up a testing strip that had turned an unusual shade of blue-green. "Really strange. The pH is almost perfectly neutral, which you wouldn't expect from contaminated water. Heavy metals are practically non-existent. And the mineral content?" He trailed off, staring at the readout on his electronic device. "What about the mineral content?" Danny looked up at her, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Mom, this water is loaded with rare earth elements. I'm talking about concentrations that shouldn't occur naturally in this geological formation." Margaret felt her heart skip. "Meaning what, exactly?"
meaning either there's been massive contamination from some kind of industrial process, or, Danny paused, seeming to gather his courage, or we're sitting on top of one of the richest rare earth deposits ever discovered in North America. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Rare earth elements were the foundation of modern technology. Everything from smartphones to electric car batteries to military defense systems depended on these materials, and most of the world's supply was controlled by China, making domestic sources incredibly valuable from both economic and national security perspectives. "How valuable are we talking about?" she asked quietly. Danny consulted his notebook, where he'd been scribbling calculations. Conservative estimate based on these concentrations, and assuming the deposit extends even a fraction of what the lake area suggests, we could be looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, possibly billions. Margaret stared out at the dark water that had seemed like nothing but a burden for so long. "No wonder they want us gone." "Mom, there's something else." Danny's voice had taken on a more urgent tone. "I've been thinking about the contamination story, about how the lake changed. What if they didn't just want to make it appear worthless? What if they needed to kill off all the aquatic life to prevent anyone from noticing the unusual mineral concentrations? How would they do that? There are chemicals that can disrupt aquatic ecosystems without leaving obvious traces. Surfactants that change water surface tension, making it impossible for fish to extract oxygen properly. Compounds that interfere with algae photosynthesis, collapsing the food chain from the bottom up." Danny was speaking faster now, his geological training merging with what was clearly a growing sense of outrage. It would take time to work, maybe months or even a year, but it would eventually kill everything in the lake while making the water look polluted rather than poisoned. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You're talking about deliberate environmental destruction." "I'm talking about people who saw a multi-billion-dollar opportunity and were willing to commit ecological murder to get it. And they almost got away with it. If you'd signed that contract yesterday, if we hadn't started asking questions, we still might not get away with anything," Margaret said quietly. "Even if you're right, even if we can prove what they've done, how do we fight people with enough power to manipulate federal agencies?" Danny was quiet for a moment, staring out at the lake with the same expression David used to wear when he was working through a particularly complex electrical problem. "We gather evidence," he said finally. "Real evidence, not just theories. And then we find someone with the power to act on it." "Like who?" "I don't know yet, but someone, somewhere, has to care about the truth." Danny turned back to his testing equipment, his jaw set with determination. "In the meantime, we need to document everything. I want water samples from multiple locations, soil samples from around the shoreline, and photographs of everything." Margaret watched her son work with growing admiration and fear in equal measure. His determination reminded her so much of David that it was almost painful. But David had never faced enemies this powerful or stakes this high. The thought of losing Danny the way she'd lost David, of watching another man she loved destroyed by forces beyond their control, made her stomach clench with anxiety. "Danny," she said carefully, "what if we're wrong? What if we're seeing patterns that aren't there because we want to believe there's a way out of this mess?" Her son looked up from the water sample he was collecting, his expression serious but unshaken. "Then we'll know we tried everything before we gave up. But Mom, look at this water. Really look at it." Margaret followed his gaze to the lake surface, noting again the odd way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "What am I supposed to see?" "The color isn't from contamination," Danny said. "It's from mineral suspension. Those particles that give it that dark, oily look, they're rare earth elements in solution. This lake isn't dead, Mom. It's been turned into a liquid mining operation." Before Margaret could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching made them both turn toward the access road. Two black SUVs were making their way up the mountain, moving with the same purposeful precision as Agent Harrison's sedan the day before. "That's not good," Danny said, quickly gathering his testing equipment. "Hide the samples," Margaret said urgently. "If they're here to pressure us, they can't know what we've found."
Danny nodded, stuffing water samples and testing strips into his backpack, while Margaret tried to arrange herself in a pose of casual observation rather than frantic investigation. But as the SUVs pulled into their makeshift parking area and disgorged not just Harrison and Webb, but 4 additional men in tactical gear, Margaret realized that the time for subtlety had probably passed. Agent Harrison approached them with the same polished smile as before, but his companions remained by the vehicles, their stance suggesting readiness for trouble rather than bureaucratic discussion. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Chen," Harrison called out as he walked toward them. "I hope you don't mind the additional personnel. Given the environmental concerns, we felt it was important to have a full assessment team on site." "Assessment team?" asked Danny, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension Margaret could see in his shoulders. "Environmental specialists," Webb answered, gesturing toward the men who were now unloading equipment from the SUVs. "We need to begin preliminary containment procedures immediately, regardless of whether your mother decides to accept our offer." Margaret felt her world tilt as she realized what was happening. They weren't here to negotiate or even to pressure her into signing. They were here to take the property whether she agreed or not, using environmental emergency powers that would bypass normal legal protections. "You can't just take our land," she said, her voice sharper than she had intended. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, under federal environmental emergency statutes, we can," Harrison replied, his polished demeanor slipping slightly to reveal something harder underneath. "When contamination poses an immediate threat to public health and groundwater safety, the government has broad powers to secure and remediate affected areas." "What contamination?" Danny demanded, stepping protectively closer to his mother. "Show us the test results. Show us the documentation that justifies declaring an environmental emergency." Harrison's smile turned genuinely cold. "I'm afraid that information is classified for national security reasons, but I assure you, Mr. Chen, the threat is very real." Margaret watched the interplay between her son and the federal agent, seeing the careful dance of words that was really a battle for control of the narrative. Harrison was skilled at this, probably had years of experience in manipulating property owners into compliance. But Danny had something the agent might not have expected: genuine expertise and the stubborn refusal to be intimidated that he had inherited from both his parents. National security? Danny's voice carried a note of academic skepticism that Margaret recognized from his college debates. What kind of contamination poses a national security threat? Chemical weapons? Radioactive materials? Or is it the kind of contamination that happens to contain billions of dollars worth of strategic minerals? The change in Harrison's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Surprise, quickly followed by calculation. Webb stepped forward as if to intervene, but Harrison held up a hand to stop him. "That's a very interesting theory, Mr. Chen. Tell me, what makes you think this particular contamination might involve strategic minerals?" Margaret felt her breath catch as she realized they'd walked into a trap. Harrison wasn't trying to intimidate them anymore. He was trying to find out how much they knew and how they'd figured it out. Any answer Danny gave would reveal the extent of their investigation and potentially compromise their only advantage. "I don't think anything," Danny said carefully. "I'm asking why a routine environmental remediation requires national security classification and a tactical team. Perhaps because routine environmental contamination doesn't typically generate this level of public interest," a new voice said from behind them. Margaret turned to see a woman approaching from the tree line, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. She was perhaps 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothing that suggested outdoor work rather than office politics. But what caught Margaret's attention, though, was the small digital camera in her hand and the press badge hanging from her neck.
"Sarah Martinez, Denver Environmental Watch," the woman said, extending her hand to Margaret. "I got a tip about unusual federal activity in this area. Mind if I ask what's going on?" Harrison's face had gone pale, and Margaret could see Webb speaking urgently into a radio. The tactical team was starting to move, but their purpose had suddenly become less clear. Were they here to secure the area from contamination or from media attention? "This is a restricted area," Harrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You need to leave immediately." "Actually,"
Sarah Martinez replied, with the calm confidence of someone who knew her rights. "This is private property, and unless you have a court order or can demonstrate immediate public danger, I have every right to be here with the owner's permission." She turned to Margaret. "I do have your permission to be here, don't I, Mrs. Chen?" Margaret looked at this unexpected ally, then at her son, then at the federal agents who were clearly struggling to maintain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond their ability to manage. "Yes," she said firmly, "you have my permission." "Excellent." Sarah Martinez raised her camera and began taking photographs of the tactical team, the equipment being unloaded from the SUVs, and the lake itself. "Now, Agent Harrison, it is Agent Harrison, isn't it? Could you explain why a routine environmental cleanup requires what appears to be a small military operation?" Harrison looked like a man whose careful plans had just collided with an immovable object. Margaret could practically see him weighing his options: retreat and regroup, escalate to force, or try to bluff his way through a situation that was no longer under his control. "There are serious contamination issues here. Public safety requires immediate action." "What kind of contamination?" Sarah asked, continuing to photograph everything around her. "Chemical? Biological? Radiological? And what's the source?" "That information is part of an ongoing investigation. But surely you can share the basic nature of the threat. After all, if it's serious enough to require federal intervention, the public has a right to know what they might be exposed to." Margaret watched this verbal chess match with growing fascination. Sarah Martinez clearly knew exactly what questions to ask and how to ask them in a way that made evasion look suspicious. More importantly, she was forcing Harrison to choose between revealing information he didn't want to share and appearing to hide something significant. "The contamination appears to be related to historical mining activities. Heavy metals and possibly radioactive materials from old uranium prospecting in the area." Danny stepped forward, his expression carefully controlled. "That's interesting, Agent Harrison. Uranium prospecting would typically leave specific isotopic signatures in the soil and water. Could you share which isotopes you've detected? As a geologist, I'd be very interested in the specifics." Harrison's pause was telling. "Those details are part of the ongoing investigation. But surely basic radiological safety would require immediate public notification if uranium contamination was suspected. The EPA has very specific protocols for uranium contamination. Has the EPA been notified? Have radiation safety specialists been consulted?" "All appropriate agencies have been informed." But his voice lacked conviction. Margaret realized they had him. Whatever was really happening here, it wasn't following the protocols that would be required for genuine environmental contamination. Harrison was improvising, trying to create a plausible cover story on the spot and failing under the pressure of informed questioning. "Agent Harrison," she said quietly, "I think it's time you told us what's really going on here." The federal agent looked at her for a long moment, and Margaret could see him reassessing the situation. The tactical team was still standing by their vehicles, clearly waiting for orders that weren't coming. Webb was continuing his urgent radio conversations, probably trying to get guidance from superiors who hadn't anticipated this level of complication. "Mrs. Chen, you're in possession of a valuable natural resource that has implications for national security. The offer we made yesterday was generous compensation for allowing the government to develop that resource. If you refuse that offer, we'll be forced to use eminent domain proceedings." "What natural resource?" Sarah Martinez asked immediately, her camera coming back up. Harrison realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late. The cat was out of the bag, and there was no putting it back. That information is classified.
But you just admitted there is a valuable natural resource here, Danny said. Which means this isn't about contamination at all. This is about seizing private property to benefit government or corporate interests. The national security implications, Harrison began. "I'll cut the bullshit," Sarah Martinez interrupted, her professional demeanor slipping to reveal genuine anger. "This is about rare earth elements, isn't it? Someone found a deposit, and instead of following legal procedures for mineral rights acquisition, you decided to manufacture a contamination scare to steal the land." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison looked like a man who just watched his career implode in real time. Webb had stopped his radio conversations and was staring at his partner with something approaching panic. Even the tactical team seemed to sense that the situation had fundamentally changed. "I want everyone off my property," Margaret said, her voice carrying an authority she hadn't felt in years. "Now!" "Mrs. Chen, you don't understand the implications," Harrison tried. "I understand that you've been lying to me since yesterday. I understand that you tried to steal my land by convincing me it was worthless when you knew it was worth millions. And I understand that you've probably committed multiple federal crimes in the process." Margaret's voice grew stronger with each word, fueled by 3 years of helpless rage that finally had a target. "Get out!" Harrison looked to his technical team, then to Webb, then back to Margaret. Whatever orders he'd been operating under clearly hadn't accounted for a situation like this. "This isn't over, Mrs. Chen. The government will get this land one way or another." "Maybe," Sarah Martinez said, still photographing everything. "But now it's going to happen in full view of the public, with legal oversight and proper compensation. No more backroom deals and manufactured emergencies." As the federal team packed up their equipment and retreated to their vehicles, Margaret felt a mixture of triumph and terror that left her slightly dizzy. They'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. If anything, they'd just made enemies of people with vast resources and questionable ethics. "What happens now?" she asked Sarah Martinez as the SUVs disappeared down the mountain road. "Now we make sure this story gets told," the reporter replied. "And we find you the best mineral rights attorney in Colorado because you're going to need one." Danny put his arm around Margaret's shoulders, and she could feel him trembling slightly with adrenaline and exhaustion. "Mom, are you sure about this? They're not going to give up. They'll come back with lawyers, court orders, whatever it takes." Margaret looked out of the lake that had been her burden and was now revealed as her salvation. "Your father always said that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when you can't win. But maybe this time we actually can win." As the afternoon sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning mist, Margaret Chen stood on her property and felt something she'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by loss and surrender. The fight ahead would be difficult, possibly dangerous, but for the first time in 3 years, she had something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. The lake lay before them, dark and mysterious, holding secrets that powerful people had killed to keep hidden. But secrets, once exposed to sunlight, had a way of losing their power over the people they were meant to control. And Margaret Chen was done being controlled. The war room that had once been Margaret's living room bore little resemblance to the quiet space where she and David used to watch evening news and plan their retirement. Now the coffee table was buried under geological surveys, legal documents, and printouts from Sarah Martinez's laptop, while Danny's testing equipment occupied every available surface. The transformation had taken place over 3 intense days since their confrontation with Agent Harrison. 3 days of phone calls, research, and the gradual assembly of a puzzle that was revealing itself to be far more complex and dangerous than any of them had imagined. Sarah Martinez sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by documents she'd obtained through a combination of Freedom of Information Act requests, journalistic contacts, and what she cheerfully admitted was creative interpretation of public records laws. Her laptop displayed a complex web of corporate connections that looked like something from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream, except that every link was documented with official filings and government contracts. "Okay," Sarah said, adjusting her reading glasses and consulting a thick folder of papers. "Let me walk you through what we've discovered, because it's bigger than just your leg, much bigger." Margaret settled into David's old recliner, the worn leather still carrying the faint scent of his aftershave even after all these months. Danny took his usual spot on the couch, notebook in hand, ready to record whatever revelations were coming. The past 3 days had been a crash course in geopolitics, corporate malfeasance, and the hidden economics of national security, subjects that seemed abstract and distant from their mountain cabin until suddenly they weren't.
The company that did the exploratory mining up the mountain 4 years ago, Sarah began, was called Rocky Mountain Geological Services. Sounds innocent enough, right? Turns out, RMGS is a subsidiary of Apex Mineral Consortium, which is itself owned by a shell company called Strategic Resources International. And Strategic Resources International is, Danny prompted, jointly owned by three entities: the Department of Defense, through a classified procurement division, Sindutai Technologies, which is one of the largest rare earth processing companies in the world, and something called the Blackwater Strategic Fund. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the cabin's old windows. Blackwater? As in the military contractor? The very same, though they've rebranded themselves several times since their Iraq War scandals. Sarah pulled up another document on her laptop. Here's where it gets interesting. The DoD has been quietly panicking about rare earth element dependency for the past decade. 90% of the world's rare earth processing is controlled by China, and these elements are absolutely critical for everything from guided missile systems to encrypted communications equipment. Danny leaned forward, his geological training helping him process the implications faster than Margaret could. So the military needs a domestic rare earth supply for national security reasons. Exactly. But here's the problem. Most known rare earth deposits in the United States are either already claimed by private mining companies or they're in areas where environmental regulations make extraction politically impossible. Sarah scrolled through more documents, her expression growing darker. So someone in the Pentagon got creative. How creative? Archie asked, though she was beginning to suspect she didn't want to know the answer. They created a black budget program called Project Mountain Home. The goal was to identify unclaimed rare earth deposits on private land and acquire them through what the documents euphemistically call non-traditional procurement methods. Margaret stared at the reporter, feeling the ground shift beneath her understanding of how the world worked. Non-traditional procurement methods. Fraud, essentially. Create environmental emergencies to justify emergency land seizures, manufacture contamination scares to drive down property values, use shell companies to buy distressed properties at below-market prices. Sarah's voice carried the controlled anger of someone who'd spent years exposing institutional corruption. Your lake wasn't their first target, Margaret. It was their seventh. The number hit like a physical blow. 7 families? 7 families, 8 properties, and approximately $4 billion in stolen mineral wealth. Sarah handed Margaret a printout showing a map of the western United States dotted with red markers. Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico. All similar situations. Remote properties with rare earth deposits, all acquired through manufactured environmental emergencies or suspicious tax forfeitures. Danny was studying the map intently, his expression a mixture of fascination and horror. How did they identify the deposits in the first place? That's where it gets really ugly, Sarah said. Remember the National Defense Authorization Act of 2019? It included funding for a comprehensive geological survey of strategic mineral resources, ostensibly for national security planning, but it also created a database of every significant rare earth deposit in the country, including ones on private property. So they used taxpayer money to create a target list for their own criminal enterprise, Margaret said slowly. Worse than that, they used national security classification to keep the survey results secret so property owners had no idea what they were sitting on. Then they used that same classified information to systematically steal the most valuable deposits. Sarah's laptop screen now showed what appeared to be an organizational chart. Project Mountain Home has been operating for 3 years. Total estimated value of acquired properties, over $10 billion. Amount paid to original property owners, less than $50 million. Margaret felt something cold and sharp settling in her chest. It wasn't just greed or even garden-variety government corruption. It was systematic theft on a scale that boggled the mind, wrapped in the flag of national security and carried out by people who'd sworn oaths to protect the Constitution. Who knows about this? She asked. That's the question, isn't it? Sarah pulled up another document, this one bearing the letterhead of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Based on the documentation I've been able to find, the program was authorized by a handful of people in the Pentagon and briefed to select members of Congress on the intelligence committees. But the actual operations? Those seem to be run by a very small group of people in the defense contractor world. Including Agent Harrison?
Harrison's interesting, Sarah said, consulting her notes. He's not technically a federal employee. He works for something called Federal Resource Management Services, which is a private contractor that provides specialized acquisition support to government agencies. FRMS is owned by, guess who? Strategic Resources International, Danny said grimly. Bingo. So Harrison and his team aren't rogue federal agents. They're private contractors carrying out a black budget operation with quasi-legal authority. Sarah's expression grew even more serious, which means they have fewer constraints on their behavior than actual federal employees would. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lake that had become the center of a conspiracy she was still struggling to fully comprehend. The water looked the same as it had for months, dark, still, seemingly lifeless, but now she knew that its altered appearance was the result of deliberate poisoning, that the death of every fish and bird had been calculated collateral damage in a theft worth billions of dollars. "How much is our deposit worth?" she asked without turning around. Based on Danny's initial analysis and some back-of-the-envelope calculations using USGS pricing data, Sarah said, conservative estimate is about $2 billion. If the deposit extends beyond your property boundaries, which the geological indicators suggest it might, we could be looking at the largest rare earth find in North American history. $2 billion. Margaret tried to wrap her mind around a number that large, but it seemed as abstract as the distance to stars. What wasn't abstract was the understanding that people had been willing to commit federal crimes, destroy an entire ecosystem, and potentially ruin her family's life over it. "There's something else," Danny said quietly. He'd been unusually subdued during Sarah's presentation, and Margaret could see that something was troubling him beyond the scope of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. "What is it?" she asked. "I've been thinking about the timeline. The mining exploration 4 years ago, the lake contamination, Dad's cancer diagnosis." Danny's voice trailed off, and Margaret felt her blood turn to ice as she began to understand what he was suggesting. "You think there's a connection?" "Mom, Dad spent every morning fishing on that lake. If they were using chemical agents to kill the ecosystem, if there was industrial contamination from their exploration work..." Danny looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "What if Dad's cancer wasn't just bad luck?" The suggestion hit Margaret like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her grab the window frame for support. David's cancer was aggressive and unusual, the doctors had said. Lung cancer in a man who'd never smoked, who'd never worked around asbestos or other known carcinogens. They'd attributed it to environmental factors, possibly radon exposure from living in the mountains. But what if it had been something far more specific and sinister? "We don't know that," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But we could find out," Sarah said gently. "If you're willing, we could have his medical records reviewed by ontologists who specialize in industrial exposure cases. We could test soil and water samples for the specific compounds that might have been used to contaminate the lake." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of grief suddenly combined with a rage so pure it was almost overwhelming. If David's death had been the unintended consequence of their scheme, it transformed everything from a property crime to something approaching murder. "Yes," she said firmly. "Test everything. I want to know." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of Sarah's laptop and the distant sound of wind through the pines. Margaret could feel her son and their unexpected ally watching her, probably wondering if the revelation would break her or strengthen her resolution. The truth was she wasn't sure herself, but she knew that David would have wanted the truth, whatever it revealed. "There's something else," Sarah said carefully. "Something that makes this situation even more urgent than we thought."
Margaret turned back to face the room, bracing herself for whatever new horror was coming. I've been monitoring federal contracting databases, and yesterday, Strategic Resources International filed a request for emergency mineral extraction permits covering an area that includes your property and about 12,000 acres surrounding it. Sarah pulled up a map on her laptop that showed their valley highlighted in red. If those permits are approved, they'll have legal authority to begin large-scale mining operations within 30 days. Even if we refuse to sell? Danny asked. They're planning to use eminent domain, claiming national security justification. The permits request mentions critical infrastructure development in support of defense manufacturing requirements. Sarah's expression was grim. With the right political support, they could seize this entire valley, and everyone in it would have no choice but to relocate.
Margaret felt the walls closing in around her. Even if they could prove the conspiracy, even if they could expose the crimes that had been committed, the machinery of government and corporate power was already in motion to complete the theft through legal means. How do we stop it? She asked. We go public, Sarah said immediately. Full media exposure, congressional hearings, federal investigations. Make it too expensive politically for them to continue. And if that doesn't work? Sarah and Danny exchanged a look that Margaret didn't like. Then we hope the courts will protect property rights over national security claims, Sarah said. But honestly, that's not a bet I'd want to make. Margaret sank back into David's chair, feeling the full weight of what they were up against. It wasn't just Harrison and his team. It wasn't even just Strategic Resources International. It was a system that had been deliberately designed to circumvent legal protections and democratic oversight, staffed by people who saw property rights and environmental protection as obstacles to be overcome, rather than principles to be respected. There is one other option, Danny said slowly. Something that might force their hand. What kind of option? Margaret asked. We could start our own mining operation. The suggestion was so unexpected that both Margaret and Sarah stared at him in silence for several seconds. Explain, Sarah said finally. If Mom files for mineral rights and begins extraction operations, she becomes the legal operator of record. Even under eminent domain, the government would have to prove that national security requires them to take over an active mining operation rather than simply purchasing the output through normal commercial channels. Danny's voice grew more excited as he worked through the implications. It would force them to justify seizing a working mine from an American citizen, which is a much harder political sell than rescuing contaminated land. But I don't know anything about mining, Margaret protested. You don't have to. You just have to file the paperwork and begin preliminary operations. Hire a mining consultant, get the permits, start the process. Even if you never extract a single pound of ore, the legal framework would give you much stronger protection against seizure. Sarah was nodding slowly. It's brilliant, actually. It flips the narrative from government rescues polluted land to government steals working mine from widow. Much harder to spin. Margaret looked between her son and the journalist, seeing hope in their faces for the first time since this nightmare had begun. But she also saw the enormous risks involved. And if they decide to use force anyway, if they decide that the stakes are too high to worry about political blowback, then at least we'll have tried everything, Danny said quietly. And maybe we'll have made it expensive enough that they think twice before doing this to someone else. Margaret stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where she kept a framed photograph of David taken on their wedding day. He looked so young in the picture, so confident and full of plans for their future together. She wondered what he would have done in this situation, whether he would have chosen the safe path of taking whatever compensation was offered or the dangerous path of fighting for what was right. But even as she wondered, she knew the answer. David had never backed down from a fight when principle was at stake, even when the odds were against him. It was one of the things she loved most about him, his absolute inability to accept injustice even when fighting it would cost him. What do we need to do?
she asked, turning back to face Danny and Sarah. First, we file for mineral rights with the state of Colorado, Danny said, already reaching for his laptop. Then we retain a mining law attorney and begin the permit process. We'll need geological surveys, environmental impact assessments, operational plans. And while we're doing that, Sarah added, I'll be getting this story ready for publication. The more public attention we can generate, the harder it will be for them to simply steamroll over us. Margaret nodded, feeling something that might have been courage beginning to build in her chest. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, the same quality that had gotten the Chen family through 43 years of marriage, David's illness, and 3 years of financial struggle. How long do we have? She asked. Based on the permit timeline, maybe 3 weeks before they can begin forced acquisition proceedings, Sarah said. So we need to move fast.
Then let's move, Margaret said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. Let's show these bastards that some people still believe in fighting for what's right. As they began making phone calls and filing documents, Margaret felt David's presence in the room like a warm hand on her shoulder. He would have been proud of what they were attempting, she thought. Proud and probably a little scared, because he'd always been honest about the risks of standing up to powerful people. But he would have stood up anyway, because that's what good people did when faced with injustice. They stood up, even when they were afraid, even when the odds were against them, even when the cost might be everything they had. Outside, the lake lay dark and still under the afternoon sun, holding its secrets and its wealth beneath a surface that no longer reflected light properly. But soon, Margaret thought, it would reflect something else entirely, the determination of ordinary people to fight for their rights against a system that had forgotten that power was supposed to serve justice, not the other way around. The war for Willow Lake was about to begin in earnest, and Margaret Chen was finally ready to fight it. The sound of helicopters had become a constant presence over Willow Lake, their rotors beating against the mountain air like mechanical heartbeats that never quite found a steady rhythm. Margaret watched 3 of them circle the valley from her kitchen window, black shapes against the brilliant blue October sky that had once seemed so peaceful and now felt like a war zone. It had been 2 weeks since they'd filed the mineral rights claim, 2 weeks of legal maneuvering, media attention, and escalating pressure that had transformed their quiet mountain property into the center of a national controversy. Sarah Martinez's initial story had exploded across social media and been picked up by major news outlets, turning Project Mountain Home into a household phrase and Margaret Chen into an unlikely symbol of resistance against government overreach. The kitchen table was covered with newspapers from across the country, their headlines telling the story of a battle that had grown far beyond anything Margaret could have imagined. Widow fights Pentagon land grab, rare earth conspiracy exposed, the trillion-dollar theft you've never heard of. Her photograph appeared in most of them, a 62-year-old woman in flannel and hiking boots standing defiantly beside a lake that had become the symbolic heart of corporate corruption and government abuse. Danny burst through the kitchen door with the energy of someone who had been surviving on coffee and determination for days. His beard was scruffy, his eyes were bright with exhaustion and excitement, and he carried a thick folder of documents that had become his constant companion. "Mom, you need to see this," he said, spreading the papers across the table with barely controlled enthusiasm. "The independent geological survey came back, the one we commissioned through the mining law firm." Margaret set down her coffee cup, noting the way her son's hands were trembling slightly. Good news or bad news? Incredible news, mind-blowing news. Danny pulled out a detailed geological map covered with colored symbols and numerical notations. The rare earth deposit doesn't just extend under our property, it extends under most of the valley, probably stretching all the way to the national forest boundary. How much are we talking about? Danny consulted his notes, his voice dropping to a whisper as if he couldn't quite believe the numbers himself. Conservative estimate, based on core samples and seismic analysis, $15 billion. If the deposit is as extensive as the preliminary data suggests, we could be looking at the largest concentration of strategic rare earth elements ever discovered in North America. Margaret stared at the geological map, trying to process numbers that seemed to exist in a different realm from her normal understanding of money. $15 billion.
It was more than the GDP of some small countries, more than the annual budget of most government agencies. It was enough money to buy senators, judges, and presidents if necessary. No wonder they were willing to commit federal crimes to get it, she said quietly. Danny, there's more. March's voice carried a note of something that might have been vindication. The independent environmental analysis confirmed what we suspected about the lake contamination. They didn't just use surfactants to kill the ecosystem. They used a compound called tributyl oxide. It's a biocide that was banned for most uses in the 1980s because of its carcinogenic properties. Margaret felt her breath catch. David's cancer? Dr. Rodriguez at National Jewish Health reviewed David's medical records and the environmental data. She can't prove a direct causal link, but she said the cancer type and progression are consistent with tributyl exposure. Marge's voice grew harder, and she said that anyone who knowingly introduced that compound into a water system where people lived and fished was essentially conducting chemical warfare against civilians. The weight of that confirmation settled over Margaret like a physical presence. For 3 years, she had carried the guilt of being unable to save David, the constant question of whether she'd missed warning signs or failed to get him the right treatment quickly enough. Now she knew that his death might have been the unintended consequence of a criminal conspiracy, that the man she had loved for 43 years had been sacrificed on the altar of corporate greed. The sound of vehicles approaching interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see a convoy of black SUVs making their way up the mountain road, moving with the familiar precision of federal law enforcement. But this time, they weren't alone. Following behind them was a caravan of news vans, their satellite dishes glinting in the afternoon sun like technological vultures drawn to the scent of scandal. "Showtime," Danny said grimly, moving to the window to get a better view of the approaching vehicles. Margaret straightened her shoulders and checked her appearance in the hall mirror. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd learned that being the face of a national story required a certain amount of performance. The media wanted her to look like someone worth rooting for, determined but not angry, principled but not political, sympathetic but not pitiful. It was exhausting, this constant awareness that every word and gesture would be analyzed and interpreted by millions of people she'd never meet. The knock on the door came precisely at 3 o'clock, as if someone had been watching the clock and waiting for the appointed hour. Margaret opened it to find Agent Harrison flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who radiated the kind of quiet authority that suggested very high-level government positions. "Mrs. Chen," Harrison said, his voice carefully neutral, "I'd like you to meet Deputy Secretary of Defense James Morrison and Deputy Attorney General Patricia Webb. They'd like to discuss a resolution to the current situation." Margaret stepped aside to let them enter, noting the way their eyes immediately cataloged everything in the room: the newspaper clippings, the geological surveys, the testing equipment that had become a permanent fixture of their kitchen. These were people accustomed to gathering intelligence, to understanding their opponents before engaging in negotiations. "Mrs. Chen," Morrison said, settling into David's old recliner with the casual confidence of someone who was used to being the most important person in any room. "I want to start by saying that certain aspects of this situation have been handled inappropriately. The Department of Defense takes allegations of misconduct very seriously." "Allegations?" Danny stepped forward, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You mean the documented evidence of systematic fraud, environmental destruction, and illegal land seizures?" Morrison's smile was polished and perfectly calibrated. "Mr. Chen, I understand your frustration, but we need to separate legitimate policy concerns from conspiracy theories and media sensationalism." Margaret watched this careful dance of words, recognizing it as the opening moves in a negotiation that would determine not just her family's future, but potentially the fate of 7 other families who'd been victimized by Project Mountain Home. Morrison and Webb represented the machinery of government, trying to contain a scandal that threatened to expose decades of abuse. Harrison represented the private contractors who'd carried out the dirty work. And she represented something that none of them had expected to encounter: ordinary people who refused to be quietly victimized. "What kind of resolution are you proposing?" she asked. Webb opened a briefcase and withdrew a document that was substantially thicker than the insulting one-page contract Harrison had originally offered. The Justice Department is prepared to offer full compensation for your property based on fair market value, including the mineral rights. We're also prepared to establish a remediation fund for environmental damage and a compensation fund for any health impacts related to industrial activities in the area. "How much compensation?" Margaret asked. $250 million, plus relocation assistance, medical coverage for life, and a confidentiality agreement that would prevent further public discussion of these matters. The number hung in the air like an offering to the gods. $250 million was more money than Margaret could spend in 10 lifetimes, enough to ensure that Danny and any future grandchildren would never want for anything. It was also, she realized, a tiny fraction of what the mineral deposit was actually worth. And the other families? The ones who were cheated out of their property over the past 3 years? Morrison and Webb exchanged a look. Similar arrangements would be made for anyone who can demonstrate legitimate claims. "What about accountability?" Danny demanded. "What about prosecuting the people who committed these crimes?" "Mr. Chen," Webb said carefully, "the justice system requires that we balance the need for accountability with national security concerns. Some aspects of these operations were conducted under classified authorities that limit our ability to pursue certain types of prosecution." Margaret felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest as she realized what they were really offering. Money in exchange for silence. Compensation in exchange for allowing the guilty parties to escape justice. A comfortable retirement bought with complicity in covering up crimes that had cost her husband's life. "No," she said quietly. The words seemed to surprise everyone in the room, including Danny. Morrison's practiced smile faltered slightly, and Webb leaned forward as if she hadn't heard correctly. "I'm sorry?" Morrison said.
"No," Margaret repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I won't take your money, and I won't sign your confidentiality agreement. You killed my husband, you destroyed our lake, and you stole from 7 other families. I don't want your guilt money. I want justice." Morrison's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Chen, I think you may be misunderstanding the generous nature of this offer. The alternative is a lengthy legal battle that you're unlikely to win against opponents with unlimited resources." "Maybe," Margaret said, "but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." "Think about your son's future," Webb added, her voice taking on a subtle, threatening tone. "These kinds of public battles can have consequences that extend beyond the immediate parties involved." Danny stepped closer to his mother, his jaw set with the same stubborn determination that had characterized David's approach to every challenge. "Are you threatening us?" "We're simply pointing out realities," Morrison said smoothly. "Mrs. Chen, you're 62 years old. You can take this settlement and live comfortably for the rest of your life, or you can spend your remaining years fighting a system that will outlast you. Which choice honors your husband's memory?" The question hit like a slap, but it also crystallized something that had been building in Margaret's mind for weeks. She thought about David lying in his hospital bed, too weak to speak, but still squeezing her hand when she told him she loved him. She thought about the man who'd never backed down from a fight when principle was at stake, who'd taught Danny to stand up for what was right even when it was costly. "David's memory is honored by making sure this never happens to anyone else," she said firmly. "By making sure the people responsible face consequences for their actions. By fighting for the truth even when it's hard." Morrison stood up, his diplomatic mask slipping to reveal something much colder underneath. "Mrs. Chen, you're making a serious mistake, the kind of mistake that people sometimes don't recover from." "Is that a threat?"
Sarah Martinez's voice came from the kitchen doorway, where she'd been quietly recording the entire conversation on her phone. Because threatening witnesses to federal crimes is itself a federal crime, Deputy Secretary Morrison. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and electric. Morrison and Webb turned to stare at the journalist with expressions of pure fury, while Harrison reached for his radio with the instinctive movement of someone whose cover had just been blown. "You're recording this?" Webb demanded. "I'm documenting it, along with the implicit threats, the attempted bribery of witnesses, and the obstruction of justice, all of which will make excellent follow-up stories to the Project Mountain Home exposé." Morrison looked like a man who just watched his political career explode in real time. "That recording is inadmissible without consent. In Colorado, only one party to a conversation needs to consent to recording. Mrs. Chen consented. I consented. We're good." The federal officials retreated in barely controlled fury, leaving behind threats of legal action and dire warnings about the consequences of defying the government. But as their convoy disappeared down the mountain road, followed by the news vans eager to report on this latest development, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since David's death, a sense of righteous purpose that transcended personal interest. Over the following weeks, the story exploded across the national media with the force of a political earthquake. Congressional hearings were announced. The FBI launched an investigation into Project Mountain Home. 3 senators called for the resignation of everyone involved in the conspiracy. Stock prices for defense contractors plummeted as investors fled anything connected to rare earth mineral extraction. Margaret found herself testifying before Congress, sitting at a witness table facing a panel of senators who asked detailed questions about her experience and the government's attempts to silence her. The hearing room was packed with cameras and reporters, turning her testimony into a nationally televised event that was watched by millions of Americans. "Mrs. Chen, in your opinion, what does this case say about the balance between national security and constitutional rights?" the committee chairman asked during her testimony. Margaret looked out at the cameras, thinking about David and the other families who'd been victimized, thinking about the principle that had motivated them to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. "Senator," she said, "I think it shows that national security can never justify abandoning the values that make America worth defending. The moment we allow the government to steal from its own citizens in the name of security, we've already lost everything that matters." The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, echoing through the hearing room and across the country as millions of people recognized the simple truth of what she'd said. 6 months later, Margaret stood beside Willow Lake on a morning when the water finally seemed to be reflecting light properly again. The environmental remediation had been successful, slowly restoring the ecosystem that had been deliberately destroyed 4 years earlier. Fish were returning, birds were nesting along the shoreline, and the water itself was gradually clearing as the toxic compounds were filtered out by natural processes. Danny had started Chen Geological Services, a consulting firm that specialized in helping property owners understand and protect their mineral rights. Sarah Martinez had won a Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on Project Mountain Home. Agent Harrison and 12 other conspirators were serving federal prison sentences, and Margaret had established the David Chen Foundation, which provided legal assistance to families fighting corporate and government abuse. The mineral rights remained in Margaret's name, but she'd licensed them to an ethical mining consortium that paid fair royalties and followed strict environmental protocols. The income was more than enough to fund the foundation's work and ensure that David's legacy would be measured not in dollars, but in justice served and rights protected. As she stood beside the healing lake, Margaret felt David's presence as strongly as she had on the day he'd first shown her this place and called it their piece of paradise. He'd been right, she realized. It was paradise, not because it was beautiful or valuable, but because it had become a place where ordinary people had proven that justice was still possible, that truth could still triumph over power, and that love could transcend even death to inspire the fight for what was right. The lake stretched before her, clear and bright in the morning sun, finally reflecting the sky the way it was meant to do. 5 years later, the morning mist rose from Willow Lake like spirits dancing toward heaven, catching the first rays of September sunlight and transforming them into something magical that no camera could quite capture. Margaret Chen sat on the expanded deck that Danny had built where the old porch swing used to be, watching her 3-year-old granddaughter Elena chase butterflies through the wildflowers that had returned to bloom along the restored shoreline. The little girl's laughter carried across the water, mixing with the calls of the herons that had come back to nest in the shallows and the splash of trout rising to catch insects in the early morning calm. It was a sound that filled the spaces in Margaret's heart that grief had carved hollow, not erasing the memory of loss, but weaving new joy into the fabric of what remained. "Grandma Maggie, look," Elena called out, holding up a smooth stone she'd found among the lake's edge. "It's pretty like water." "It is beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret replied, marveling as she did every day at how much the child resembled David, the same bright curiosity, the same gentle insistence that the world should make sense, the same ability to find wonder in the smallest details of creation. Danny emerged from the cabin carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee, moving with the easy confidence of a man who'd found his place in the world. At 31, he'd grown into his father's steady reliability while keeping his mother's fierce determination to fight for what was right. His geological consulting firm now employed 12 people and had offices in Denver and Albuquerque. But he still came to the lake every weekend, still tested the water quality monthly, still served as the unofficial guardian of the place that had changed all their lives. "Sarah's flying in this afternoon for the anniversary dinner. She's bringing her photographer, wants to do a follow-up piece on how the lake looks now compared to 5 years ago." Margaret smiled at the thought of seeing Sarah Martinez again. The journalist had become more than a professional ally over the years. She was family now, the kind of chosen sister that life sometimes provides to fill roles that blood relatives cannot. Sarah's continuing coverage of corporate environmental crimes had led to dozens of investigations and several major prosecutions, turning her from a regional reporter into one of the most respected investigative journalists in the country. "Any word from the other families?" Margaret asked. "The Hendersons are driving down from Montana. Maria Santos is flying in from New Mexico with her 2 youngest. The Petros family can't make it. Their daughter's getting married this weekend, but they sent a video message." Danny's expression grew thoughtful. "It's amazing how scattered we all are now, but how connected we still feel." The annual gathering had started 3 years ago as a simple dinner to commemorate the anniversary of our victory over Project Mountain Home. But it had evolved into something larger, a reunion of families that had been brought together by shared trauma and had chosen to build lasting bonds from the experience. They called themselves the Mountain Home Survivors, though Margaret preferred to think of them as the David Chen Foundation's founding members. The foundation had grown far beyond anything Margaret had originally envisioned. What had started as a legal defense fund for families fighting property rights abuse had become a comprehensive advocacy organization with a staff of 47 and an annual budget of $12 million. They provided legal assistance, environmental testing, and public education about corporate abuse of eminent domain laws. More importantly, they'd successfully lobbied for federal legislation that required genuine public hearings and independent oversight for any government land acquisition involving mineral rights. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from her assistant in Denver. "Senator Williams confirmed for Thursday's hearing. Committee expects 2-hour testimony on the Rare Earth Security Act." Even 5 years later, Margaret found herself regularly called to Washington to testify about legislation related to mining rights and national security. The Rare Earth Security Act was the latest attempt to create domestic rare earth production capacity without repeating the abuses of Project Mountain Home. It was complicated legislation that balanced legitimate national security needs with constitutional protections. And Margaret had become one of the few witnesses that both parties trusted to provide honest analysis. "Another trip to D.C.?" Danny asked, noting her expression as she read the message. "Thursday and Friday. Senator Williams wants me to testify about the independence requirements for geological surveys." Margaret set down her phone and returned her attention to Elena, who was now trying to skip stones across the lake's surface with limited success. "Sometimes I wonder if David would be amazed or terrified by how our lives turned out." "Both, probably," Danny said with a smile, but mostly proud. "You know he would have loved seeing Elena here." Margaret nodded, feeling the familiar bittersweet ache that came with thinking about all the things David would never experience. He would have adored being a grandfather, would have spent hours teaching Elena to fish and identify birds and understand the subtle ways that water and stone shaped the landscape over centuries of patient interaction. But he would have been equally proud of what his death had ultimately accomplished. The official cause of David's cancer had been listed as environmental exposure related to illegal chemical contamination, and his name was on the memorial plaque at the foundation's Denver headquarters alongside the names of 6 other people whose health had been damaged by Project Mountain Home's activities. Their deaths had not been in vain. They had become the foundation for a movement that had prevented countless others from suffering similar fates. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted Margaret's reflections. A familiar pickup truck was making its way up the mountain road, moving with the careful pace of someone who'd made this journey many times before. Margaret recognized the driver immediately, Tom Peterson, the county inspector who'd originally declared the lake contaminated 5 years ago. Tom had been one of the first whistleblowers to come forward after Sarah's initial story broke, revealing how he'd been pressured by federal agents to declare the lake contaminated without conducting proper tests. His testimony had been crucial in congressional hearings, and his courage in admitting his role in the cover-up had probably saved his career. Now he served as the foundation's chief environmental inspector, traveling around the country to investigate suspicious contamination claims. "Margaret," Tom called out as he climbed from his truck, his face carrying the particular expression of someone who had important news to share. "We've got a situation in Nevada that I think you need to know about." "What kind of situation?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. Even after Project Mountain Home's exposure and the prosecution of its major participants, similar schemes continued to surface with depressing regularity. The combination of valuable mineral resources and inadequate oversight created irresistible temptations for people with flexible ethics and government connections. Family outside of Carson City. Their well water started tasting metallic 6 months ago. The EPA says it's natural mineral leaching, but the pattern looks familiar. Tom handed her a folder containing water test results and geological surveys. Margaret opened the folder and scanned the test results, noting the telltale signs that had become as familiar to her as her own handwriting over the past 5 years. Unusual mineral concentrations that suggest rare earth deposits, water contamination that appeared suddenly in an area with no history of mining activity, a government environmental assessment that raised more questions than it answered. "Have you contacted Sarah?" "She's already digging into the corporate structure. Should have a preliminary report by next week." Tom's expression grew grimmer. "Margaret, there's something else. The veteran, his name is Michael Chen. No relation that we can determine, but someone with a sense of irony is sending us a message," Margaret finished. She'd learned over the years that corporate criminals often couldn't resist making their schemes personal, turning each new operation into a kind of twisted tribute to previous victories or defeats.
Danny had been listening to this conversation with growing anger. How many times do we have to expose these people before someone in Washington decides to actually stop them instead of just prosecuting them after the fact? "As many times as it takes," Margaret said quietly, closing the folder and looking back at Elena, who was now sitting at the water's edge, talking seriously to a frog that had emerged from the shallows.
That little girl is going to inherit the world we create with our choices today. I won't hand her a planet where corporations can poison people's water and steal their land without consequences." Tom nodded approvingly. The family's name is Rodriguez. They're good people, scared people. They've never been through anything like this before. "Then we'll teach them what they need to know," Margaret said, feeling the familiar stirring of purpose that had driven her through 5 years of battles against increasingly sophisticated opponents. "Set up a meeting for next week. I'll fly out to Nevada and talk to them personally." Danny said carefully, "Margaret, you know you don't have to take on every case personally. The foundation has good people who can handle this." "I know," she replied, "but some fights require more than good people. They require people who understand what it means to lose everything and choose to keep fighting anyway." The truth was that Margaret could have stepped back from the front lines years ago. The foundation was well established, competently managed, and perfectly capable of functioning without her daily involvement. Her personal financial situation was secure beyond any reasonable measure. The royalties from the lake provided more income than she could spend in several lifetimes, and prudent investment had multiplied that wealth into a legacy that would benefit environmental causes for generations. But stepping back would have felt like abandoning David's memory. "Grandma Maggie," Elena called out, running back toward the deck with her small hands cupped carefully around something. "I found a treasure." Margaret bent down as the little girl opened her hands to reveal a piece of quartz crystal that had been worn smooth by years of tumbling in the lake's currents. It caught the morning light and threw it back in tiny rainbows that danced across Elena's delighted face. "It's beautiful," Margaret said, remembering how David used to collect similar stones from the lake in the early years, back when they'd thought their biggest worry would be saving enough money for retirement. "What are you going to do with your treasure?" "Keep it forever and ever," Elena declared with the absolute certainty that only 3-year-olds could muster. "It's from the magic lake." Margaret looked out at the water that had indeed proved to be magical, though not in any way she could have predicted when they'd first bought this property. The lake had cost them David's life and 3 years of struggle, but it had also given them purpose, connection to people who shared their values, and the resources to fight for justice on a scale that could change the world. Sarah's call came early. "I've traced the Nevada operation back to its source. You're not going to like what I found." "Try me." "Remember Deputy Secretary Morrison, the one who tried to bribe you with the $250 million settlement?" Margaret felt her blood chill. Morrison had served 18 months in federal prison for his role in Project Mountain Home, a sentence that most observers considered laughably light given the scope of his crimes. He'd been released 2 years ago and had supposedly retired from public service to pursue private business interests. "He's behind the Nevada situation?" "Not directly, but his consulting firm provided the initial geological assessment that identified the rare earth deposits. The shell company that's pressuring the Rodriguez family has 3 degrees of separation from Morrison's operation, but the money trail is clear enough." Sarah's voice carried the excitement of a hunter who'd picked up a fresh scent. "Margaret, I think they're testing us, seeing if we'll respond to a direct challenge." Margaret looked at Elena, who was now showing her crystal treasure to Danny, chattering excitedly about magic lakes and underwater fairies. That little girl represented everything good and innocent in the world, everything worth protecting from people who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business.
"Then let's not disappoint them," Margaret said firmly. "Set up the meeting with the Rodriguez family. And Sarah, let's make sure Morrison knows we're coming. Some lessons need to be taught more than once." After ending the call, Margaret sat quietly on her deck, watching her granddaughter play beside the lake that had become the center of her universe. 5 years ago, she'd been a grieving widow facing financial ruin, ready to sell her birding for $100 just to escape the pain of memory.
Now she was the head of a foundation that had protected dozens of families from similar exploitation, the holder of mineral rights worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and the grandmother of a little girl who would grow up knowing that justice was possible when good people refused to surrender. The transformation had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted. The quiet retirement she and David had planned, the simple life of a mountain widow, the privacy that came with being nobody important to anyone beyond her immediate family. But it had given her something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that David's death had meaning beyond grief, that love could transcend loss to inspire action that made the world measurably better. As the afternoon approached, Margaret began preparing for the evening's anniversary dinner. The other families would arrive soon, along with Sarah and the foundation staff and the lawyers and activists who'd become part of their extended family. They would share stories and plan new strategies and remember the people they'd lost and celebrate the victories they'd won together. But first, Margaret wanted a few more minutes beside the lake that had started it all, watching Elena discover the magic that happened when sunlight touched clear water and ordinary people chose to fight for extraordinary things. The little girl's laughter echoed across the water, mixing with the songs of returned birds and the gentle splash of healthy fish, creating a symphony of restoration that was David's true memorial and Margaret's greatest treasure. The lake stretched before them, clear and bright and full of life, reflecting not just the sky, but the infinite possibility that existed when love proved stronger than fear, when justice proved more valuable than money, and when ordinary people proved capable of extraordinary courage. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering over the peaks, promising the kind of weather that would test the resolve of anyone who chose to face it. But Margaret Chen was no longer afraid of storms. She'd learned that sometimes the most beautiful rainbows only appeared after the hardest rains, and that the most important battles were won not by avoiding difficulty, but by walking straight through it toward the light that waited on the other side. "Grandma Maggie," Elena called out, "will you come see the fish?" "Of course, sweetheart," Margaret replied, rising from her chair and walking toward the water where 3 generations of the Chen family's love and loss and hope had been transformed into something that would endure long after all of them were gone. The lake stretched before them, clear and bright and full of life, reflecting not just the sky, but the infinite possibility that existed when love proved stronger than fear, when justice proved more valuable than money, and when ordinary people proved capable of extraordinary courage.
"How long have you lived here?" Margaret asked, as they settled around a kitchen table that had seen decades of family meals and homework sessions. 12 years, Maria replied, pouring glasses of iced tea from a pitcher that bore the logo of the local school district where she worked. "We bought it with Michael's VA disability settlement after he came back from Afghanistan. It wasn't much, but it was ours, a place where we could build something." Michael spread out a collection of official-looking documents across the table's surface. "Started about 8 months ago with a water quality notice from the county. Said there might be mineral contamination from an old mining operation we'd never heard of. Then came the EPA assessment, the Federal Environmental Emergency Declaration, and finally, the buyout offer." Margaret examined the documents, her trained eye immediately picking out the inconsistencies and red flags that had become familiar over 5 years of fighting similar cases. The water quality report used language that sounded alarming but was actually quite vague. The EPA assessment mentioned potential health risks without specifying what those risks were or providing actual contamination data. And the buyout offer. $15,000? Margaret looked up from the contract with barely concealed outrage. "For 12 acres in Nevada?" "They said the contamination made it worthless," Maria said quietly. "Said we were lucky they were willing to pay anything at all considering the cleanup cost."
Have you had independent testing done on your water? Michael and Maria exchanged a look. We can't afford it, Michael admitted. The VA covers my medical expenses, but there's nothing left over for things like that. We were hoping, well, Tom Peterson said you might be able to help. Margaret felt the familiar surge of anger that came with seeing ordinary people victimized by systems they didn't understand and couldn't afford to fight. The Rodriguez family was exactly the kind of target that corporate predators preferred. Isolated, financially vulnerable, lacking the resources or connections to mount effective resistance. I can help, she said firmly. In fact, I've already arranged for comprehensive water and soil testing by an independent laboratory. The team should be here tomorrow morning. You didn't have to do that, Maria said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. We can't afford you back. You're not supposed to pay me back, Margaret replied. That's what the David Chen Foundation is for. We fight these battles so families like yours don't have to fight them alone. Over the next 2 hours, Margaret listened to the Rodriguez family's story, taking detailed notes and asking the kinds of questions that would help build a case if their situation followed the familiar pattern of corporate land theft. Michael had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED explosion had left him paralyzed from the waist down. Maria had put herself through community college while caring for him and working part-time at the local elementary school. They had 2 children, a son in the Army and a daughter finishing her senior year of high school. The thing that really bothers me, Michael said as they concluded their discussion, is that they're not just trying to steal our land, they're making us feel like we're stupid for wanting to keep it, like we should be grateful for their insulting offer. It's a deliberate psychological strategy. They want you to feel powerless, overwhelmed, grateful for any way out. The faster they can get you to sign, the less chance there is that someone will ask uncomfortable questions about their claims. So what do we do? Maria asked. We fight, Margaret said simply. We test everything, document everything, and expose every lie they've told. And then we make them pay for trying to steal from a disabled veteran and his family. That evening, Margaret sat on the small porch behind the Rodriguez house, watching the desert sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost artificial in their intensity. The silence was different from the mountain quiet she was accustomed to, emptier somehow, but also more vast, carrying the sense of endless space that stretched beyond the horizon in all directions. Her phone rang, displaying Danny's number. "How's Nevada?" her son asked without preamble. "Depressingly familiar," Margaret replied. "Same playbook, different family. The only thing that's changed is they're getting more sophisticated about the paperwork." "Any sign of Morrison's involvement?" "Not directly, but the geological assessment bears his consulting firm's signature. He's smart enough to stay in the background, but his fingerprints are all over this." Margaret watched a roadrunner dart across the desert landscape, its movement so quick it seemed almost like an optical illusion. "How's Elena?"
"Missing her grandma. She asked me 3 times today when you're coming home." Danny's voice carried the warmth that always appeared when he talked about his daughter. "She's been carrying that crystal from the lake everywhere, telling everyone it's magic." "Maybe it is," Margaret said softly. "Sometimes I think that whole lake is magic. Not in any supernatural sense, but in the way it brought together all the right people at exactly the right moment to fight something that needed fighting." "Speaking of fighting," Danny said, his tone growing more serious, "Sarah called. She's found connections between the Nevada operation and 2 other cases in Utah and Arizona. She thinks they're running a systematic campaign to test whether the foundation will respond to challenges in Morrison's old territory." Margaret felt a familiar chill of recognition. Corporate criminals rarely acted randomly. They planned, they tested, they probed for weaknesses before committing to major operations. If Morrison was indeed behind the Nevada situation, it wasn't just about the Rodriguez family's mineral rights. It was about whether the David Chen Foundation could be intimidated into backing down from fights that might be too expensive or too dangerous to pursue. "Then we better make sure we send the right message," she said firmly. The next morning brought the arrival of the environmental testing team, a group of serious young scientists who approached their work with the kind of methodical precision that Margaret had learned to appreciate over years of legal battles.
They spent 6 hours taking water samples, soil cores, and air quality measurements, working with equipment that looked far more sophisticated than anything Danny had used during their initial investigation of Willow Lake. Dr. Rachel Kim, the lead team, was a hydrogeologist from UC Berkeley who specialized in detecting industrial contamination in desert environments. As she worked, she explained her process to Margaret and the Rodriguez family, turning what could have been an intimidating technical procedure into an educational experience. The thing about desert contamination, Dr. Kim said as she labeled a series of water samples, is that it's actually easier to detect than contamination in more complex environments. There's less background noise from natural organic processes, so industrial chemicals tend to stand out very clearly in the data. How long until we get results? Maria asked. Preliminary analysis should be ready in 48 hours, complete report within a week. Dr. Kim sealed the last of her samples and began packing her equipment. But I can tell you right now that your water doesn't show any of the obvious signs of heavy metal contamination. pH is normal, no unusual odors or discoloration, dissolved oxygen levels are appropriate for groundwater in this region. Michael leaned forward in his wheelchair. So they're lying about the contamination? I can't make that determination until we have complete lab results, Dr. Kim said carefully. But if there is contamination here, it's not the kind that would be immediately obvious to visual or olfactory inspection. After the testing team departed, Margaret spent the afternoon with the Rodriguez family, helping them understand their legal options and preparing them for the battles that lay ahead. It was work she'd done dozens of times over the past 5 years, but it never became routine. Each family's situation was unique. Each set of circumstances required its own strategy, and each victory or defeat had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate legal issues. The most important thing to remember, she told them as they reviewed the timeline for challenging the government's environmental claims, is that you're not alone in this fight. The Foundation has resources, connections, and 5 years of experience fighting exactly this kind of corruption. We know their tactics, we know their weaknesses, and we know how to beat them. But what if they escalate? What if they decide we're too much trouble and try to force us out some other way? Margaret thought about the threats that had been made against her own family over the years, the subtle intimidation tactics that had become increasingly sophisticated as their opponents adapted the public scrutiny. Then we document everything, make sure the media knows what's happening, and trust that public attention is still the best protection against government abuse. 3 days later, Dr. Kim's preliminary report arrived via encrypted email, and Margaret found herself staring at results that were both encouraging and deeply troubling. The good news was that the Rodriguez family's water showed no signs of the contamination that had been claimed in the government environmental assessment. Heavy metals were within normal ranges, pH was appropriate for the region, and there were no industrial chemicals present in detectable quantities. The troubling news was what the water did contain: trace elements that suggested the presence of rare earth mineral deposits in the underlying geology, not as concentrated as what they'd found at Willow Lake, but significant enough to be commercially valuable if developed on a large scale. Margaret called Sarah Martinez immediately. We've got confirmation. The contamination claims are fabricated, and there are definitely rare earth deposits on their property. How valuable?
Hard to say without more extensive geological surveys, but Dr. Kim estimates the deposits could be worth anywhere from $50 to $200 million. Margaret looked out the window of her hotel room at the desert landscape that seemed to stretch forever under the relentless Nevada sun. Sarah, this isn't just about one family anymore. If they're willing to try this in Nevada, they're probably trying it everywhere they think they can get away with it. I've been thinking the same thing. I've got calls in to contacts at the Interior Department and the EPA. If there's a systematic pattern of fraudulent environmental assessments being used to justify mineral rights seizures, we need to expose it before more families get victimized. That evening, Margaret sat with the Rodriguez family in their small living room, explaining what the test results meant and what their options were moving forward. Michael and Maria listened with the careful attention of people who understood that their entire future hung in the balance of decisions they'd never expected to have to make. "So we can fight this?" Michael asked. You can fight this, Margaret confirmed, and you can win, but it won't be easy, and it won't be quick. These people have resources, connections, and experience in manipulating government agencies. They'll use every legal and quasi-legal tactic they can think of to pressure you into giving up. What about our daughter? Maria asked. She's got 1 more year of high school, college applications pending. If this turns into a long legal battle... The foundation can help with that too, Margaret said gently. Educational support, relocation assistance if necessary, whatever it takes to make sure your family doesn't suffer while we're fighting for your rights. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands as he worked through the implications of what Margaret was offering. Finally, he looked up, and Margaret saw in his eyes the same determination that had carried him through 3 combat tours and the long rehabilitation after his injury. "They picked the wrong family to mess with," he said quietly. "I didn't survive Afghanistan just to let some corporate criminals steal my home." Margaret smiled, recognizing the moment when ordinary people decided to become extraordinary. It was a transformation she'd witnessed many times over the past 5 years, the instant when fear gave way to anger and anger crystallized into resolve. "Then let's show them what a mistake they made," she said. The flight back to Colorado gave Margaret time to think about the broader implications of what they'd discovered in Nevada. If Morrison and his associates were indeed testing the Foundation's resolve, they were also testing something larger: the willingness of American institutions to protect property rights against sophisticated criminal enterprises that wrap themselves in the flag of national security. The Rodriguez case would be crucial not just for one family, but for establishing precedents that would either strengthen or weaken the legal protections that stood between ordinary citizens and corporate predators. Win, and they'd send a message that the David Chen Foundation couldn't be intimidated or outmaneuvered. Lose, and they'd invite similar attacks on vulnerable families across the country. As the plane descended toward Denver, Margaret looked out at the Rocky Mountains rising like ancient guardians from the plains, their peaks touched with the first snow of the approaching winter. Somewhere among those mountains was Willow Lake, now clear and healthy, reflecting the sky with the perfect clarity that had taken years to restore. It was a reminder that even the most damaged places could be healed if people cared enough to do the work. Her phone buzzed with a text from Danny. "Elena wants to know if you found any treasure in Nevada." Margaret smiled as she typed her response. "Tell her Grandma found something even better than treasure. She found people worth fighting for." Because that, she realized, had been what the past 5 years had really been about. Not the money, not the legal victories, not even the satisfaction of seeing corrupt officials sent to prison. It was about the discovery that every family facing impossible odds deserved someone willing to stand with them, someone willing to fight battles that seemed unwinnable until they were won. The plane touched down in Denver as the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Margaret of the desert sunset she'd watched from the Rodriguez family's porch. Different landscapes, but the same determination to protect what mattered most. The idea that ordinary people deserved to live in security and dignity, free from the predations of those who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. Tomorrow she would begin planning the legal strategy for the Rodriguez case. She would coordinate with Sarah on media coverage, work with the Foundation's attorneys on filing deadlines, and start the long process of building a case strong enough to defeat opponents with unlimited resources and questionable ethics. But tonight she would go home to Willow Lake, where Elena would show her new treasures found along the restored shoreline, and Danny would update her on the latest developments in his consulting business. She would sit on the deck that overlooked the water where David used to fish, watching the stars reflect in the lake's clear surface, remembering how it felt to believe that justice was impossible until it became inevitable. The fight for the Rodriguez family was just beginning, but Margaret Chen was no longer the frightened widow who'd almost sold her burden for $100. She was a woman who'd learned that love could transcend loss to inspire action, that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary corruption, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not by avoiding difficulty, but by walking straight through it toward the light that waited on the other side. The mountains rose around her as she drove home through the darkness, their massive presence a reminder that some things endured despite all attempts to diminish them, like justice, like truth, like the stubborn refusal of good people to surrender what they'd built with love and sacrifice and hope for the future. The lake was waiting when she arrived, dark and peaceful under the star-filled sky, ready to reflect whatever dreams she brought to its shores. The David Chen Foundation had grown into something Margaret could never have imagined that first morning when she'd found Agent Harrison's manila envelope on her porch. From their headquarters in a restored Victorian mansion in downtown Denver, the foundation now employed over 100 people and operated satellite offices in 12 states. Their annual budget had reached $47 million, funded by mineral royalties, private donations, and a federal grant program they'd successfully lobbied Congress to establish. Margaret stood in the foundation's main conference room, surrounded by photographs documenting a decade of victories. The Rodriguez family, standing proudly beside their Nevada ranch after winning a landmark court case that established new precedents for property rights protection. The Hendersons in Montana, whose successful defense of their land had led to the prosecution of 3 federal contractors. Maria Santos in New Mexico, whose case had exposed a conspiracy involving 2 senators and resulted in the largest corporate fine in environmental crime history. But the photograph that meant the most to Margaret hung in the center of the wall. David standing beside Willow Lake on the day they'd bought the property, his arms spread wide as if he could embrace the entire mountain range. Below it was a smaller frame containing the last letter he'd written before entering the hospital. His shaky handwriting barely legible, but his message clear. Maggie, if something happens to me, don't let them win. Fight for what's right, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Grandma, they're ready for you. Elena's voice brought Margaret back to the present. At 13, Elena had grown into a serious young woman who understood that her grandmother's work was important even when she didn't fully grasp all the complexities involved. She often spent summers at the foundation office, helping with filing and learning about environmental law with the intensity of someone who already knew what she wanted to do with her life. Margaret walked to the podium where a small audience had gathered for the foundation's 10th anniversary celebration. Danny was there with his wife, Sarah Martinez. They'd married 3 years ago in a ceremony beside Willow Lake, with Elena serving as maid of honor and Tom Peterson officiating. The foundation staff filled the remaining seats, along with representatives from the dozens of families they'd helped over the decade. 10 years ago, Margaret began, I was ready to sell 15 acres of supposedly worthless land for $100 just to escape the burden of memory. Today, that same land funds an organization that has protected over 200 families from corporate theft and government abuse. She paused, looking out at faces that had become family over years of shared struggle and shared victory. But the real victory isn't measured in dollars saved or crimes prosecuted. It's measured in the knowledge that ordinary people can still fight extraordinary corruption and win, that love can transcend loss to inspire action, that justice is still possible when good people refuse to surrender what they'd built with love and sacrifice and hope for the future. The applause was warm and sustained, but Margaret barely heard it. Her attention was focused on the view through the conference room's tall windows, where the Rocky Mountains rose against the evening sky like ancient guardians watching over everything they'd built together. After the celebration, Margaret drove home to Willow Lake as she had every evening for 10 years. The water was crystal clear now, reflecting the stars with perfect clarity. Elena was spending the night with friends in Denver, and Danny was working late on a consulting project, so Margaret had the lake to herself.
She sat on the deck they had expanded twice to accommodate the steady stream of visitors who came to see the place where it all began. Somewhere in the darkness, she could hear the sound of trout rising to catch insects, the call of night birds, the gentle lap of water against the restored shoreline. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. "Grandma, I've decided what I want to study in college. Environmental law like you and Dad. Is that okay?" Margaret smiled as she typed her response. "Your grandfather would be so proud. We all would." She set down the phone and looked out at the lake that had cost her everything and given her everything in return. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new battles to fight against those who saw human suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. But tonight, she was content to sit beside the water where David used to fish, listening to the sounds of a healthy ecosystem and remembering how it felt to believe that justice was impossible until it became inevitable. The lake stretched before her, dark and peaceful under the star-filled sky, ready to reflect whatever dreams future generations would bring to its shores. What an incredible journey Margaret Chen's story has been. If this tale of courage and determination inspired you, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more amazing stories of ordinary people who refuse to give up. Your engagement helps us tell these important stories that need to be heard.